I mean, I completely agree with you on that. My experience of the encounter with the resurrected Christ is like my experience with KFC. It's just something that's there.
Where the sort of individual meets the sort of the infinite is where meaning happens. I resist the idea of sort of giving it a name. I think it is a psychological experience, but I think it's the most.
What about the question that we began with, which is, can we have meaning without God? I mean, I'm guessing you're not going to say, no, you absolutely can't have any kind of meaning without God, I think Richard.
No, I mean, of course you can have people. I'm always sort of struck by how many people I know. I mean, most of my friends are not believers, in fact. They would describe themselves as aphilatelists, I think, or quasi-philatelists or something, but they're not committed, they're not people of faith. And I don't see anything in them which suggests to me that they live lives of impoverished personal morality. On the contrary, I think lots of them live their lives very much with a view to living decently. I think there's a certain kind of life that you live that's consonant with Christian tradition and teaching and doctrine, that's different and distinctive. And as in my own life, I think it introduces a richness to it too, which wasn't there before. But the other interesting thing is, of course, most of my friends grew up as I grew up in Britain in the late 20th century. And whether we like it or not, that's a place, a time and a culture that is hugely influenced by Christianity. Because Christendom prevailed for so long, our institutions were shaped by it, and by extension, what we think, what we say, what we do, what's important to us is hugely shaped by the distinctiveness of Christianity. And it takes a long time, I think, before you can consider yourself no longer shaped or influenced by that. And I remember a friend of mine, he's a really good guy, and I remember saying to him, I was having an argument the days when I used to argue such things, and he said, look, I can live a decent moral life without any recourse to Christian tradition at all. I said, okay, sum up your belief then in exactly that way without owing anything to Christianity. He said, exactly, do unto others as you would have them do to you. Okay, it's been said before.
Except though, I mean, it's been said, but if you were to look through any biblical content with any sort of moral message, some of which clearly is going to be abhorrent to us nowadays, the bits that you discard because they're sort of their time or whatever, and then you which is, I think, perfectly valid to not pay attention to those bits and pay attention to these bits because they're more useful now. But the criteria that you use to separate those two has to be something outside.
Yeah.
The religious teaching, because that's the very thing that there has to be. So which does suggest that ultimately our kind of moral sense lies outside of that. Otherwise, how would you be able to look through the Bible and go, well, that's not relevant, and that is? Does that make sense?
I wouldn't make a distinction of relevance, really. I mean, I wouldn't edit the Bible in terms of its kind of immediate utility to me and how that accords with my sense of myself in the world now. Marcion did that in the 2nd century, one of our most prominent early heretics, in fact. Because I think I think that the religious tradition needs to preserve something distinctive and enduring against which you measure precisely your own objective experience. The extent to which you do that and how far you find that challenges your sense of where authority might lie is an interesting question. But it's not, I mean, I wouldn't edit the Bible to suit the sensibility of someone who was born in the late 20th century in somewhere like Britain, because it needs to be something that's bigger than that, I think. It needs to be a narrative which involves more than that.
Yeah.
And a narrative which holds you to account in ways that can sometimes be extremely uncomfortable. The most persuasive thing about Christianity for me is not the niceness, it's the nastiness, it's the toughness, it's the taking you to places you don't want to go, it's the echo it sends back which makes you feel bad. It's the realization of the very, very narrow limits of your own competence and fitness and ability, that kind of thing. That's the stuff which for me ultimately becomes persuasive, I think.
Yes, and that's also where the sort of where we have to search for meaning, isn't it? It's on the edges of when we're infants, we scream and the world provides. Our mother or caregiver comes and gives us what we want, and part of growing up is realizing that doesn't happen and can't happen. Part of a mother's job is to sort of, let go and let us be disillusioned, so we grow up. And tolerating then ambiguity and ambivalence and uncertainty and all those things become part of growing up. And I think any sort of mature spirituality or belief or sense of connection with anything transcendent, which I think is vital, that we all find in some sense, not in an overtly spiritual sense, but just that connection with transcendence, I think, is what we both agree is
when you
important.
say transcendence, though, in what sense do you mean it? Because when I think of transcendent, I think of something that transcends, the physicality of our world, the sort of, if all that really ultimately exists, let's say, is matter in motion and physical forces, when we have a transcendent experiences, it's almost something that takes us beyond that and says there's something more than this. And I think we're all looking for the transcendent. That seems to be a universal search across human culture. For you, though, Derren, presumably you don't feel that needs to find its end in God or something beyond the physical world that we do find ourselves in, whereas I presume for Richard it does. I'm
sure we'd probably connect greatly on it, because I think the problem is maybe the word God. The problem is any noun. I think what happens is we actually live in a world of messy, active verbs. Things are happening, but they are complex and they are ambivalent, but to navigate all of that, this sort of infinite data source, we have to reduce and tell ourselves stories and make up clear narratives. It's the only way we can move forward. And when you do that, you take, like happiness, for example. Happiness is suddenly a word and it's a noun. And actually, the reality is it isn't. It's much more about searching for meaning. It's much more about this and that, all of which are verbs. So I think the problem is maybe that words like the soul and words like God and so on can get, on the one hand, sentimentalized by the kind of New Age thinking, but also become dogmatized and too rigid by some religious thinking. I suppose my feeling towards it is that at some point in history, these ideas, whether connected around a person or whatever made a society into a community, whatever bonded them together, had a certain sort of energy to that, for want of a better word. There was a feeling and a knowledge and a thing that did give you that feeling of transcendence. And then as time goes on, that becomes, it sort of moves out of living memory. So the group tries to maintain that by certain practices and certain things that will recreate that feeling of transcendence. And then gradually that turns into an experience of belief, which is quite different from what it originally was. Belief and images and sort of dogma and signs and things that are pointing back, but they're not the thing itself. And then that is part of then what becomes sort of institutionalized and what becomes defended and sort of becomes the modern image of that religion. But it's and you could even argue as a sort of idolatry, because it's the images that become paramount, whereas actually it's the thing back there that was most important. And sorry, just to finish, but I think a lot of the problem with a lot of modern atheism is that it's very easy to knock down those things at this end, to knock down some of those sort of claims. Whereas actually what it's missing is, well, if you go back to what it's trying to articulate, that is something that's valid. But the problem is, even say the word God, when Nietzsche said God is dead, he was sort of making that point that it's, by giving it that name, it's sort of the stuff of it, the energy of it has sort of been too contained.
Rev Richard Coles tries to suggest that our sense of meaning and morality somehow comes from Christianity. But even he admits most of his friends are not believers and still live decent lives. That alone undercuts the whole argument. People clearly do not need religion to behave morally. And historically, the ideas Christians claim credit for were already around. The Golden Rule shows up in Confucian philosophy around 500 BCE, centuries before Christianity existed. Similar ideas appear in ancient Egyptian writings long before the Bible was compiled. Then, look at the Bible itself. It is full of moral contradictions. Ephesians 6:5 tells slaves to obey their masters. 1 Timothy 2:12 tells women they cannot have authority over men.
It's a summary of church history, in fact, which in lots of ways kind of conforms to that, I think, this extraordinary transforming experience that the people around Jesus of Nazareth had. But of course we don't know about that. I mean, the first writings in the New Testament, as you know, are Paul, and that's coming along quite some time after the events they described. The first gospel, the earliest, is probably around 75, a generation after the events they described, because I think the first followers of Jesus thought, and this would be consistent with the messianic teaching of that period, that the end of time was going to come within their lifetime.
Yeah.
They would see it. And then, of course, they start dying out. Hang on a minute. So we better write this down. And by the time they're writing it down, it's not reportage.
Yeah.
It's not an account of what happened. It's a theological treatise. They're already bringing to bear deep reflection on what those events might mean in a context that's suddenly changing and becoming larger. And then you get Paul comes along, and there are all sorts of, again, hugely reductive way of describing it, gross generalization too, but Paul, I think, represents the bringing together of the power of Greek thought and the power of Jewish monotheism. And those two things come together, and that's like an explosion. And you still get that now reading Paul, now this kind of extraordinary explosive force.
Why has that remained, in a sense, such a potent thing, though, 2,000 years later?
Well, two reasons, I think. One, because the tradition has been curated so carefully, preserved so carefully, but partly also because I think people continue to encounter something in that is absolutely vital and dynamic. And now, that experience of encountering the reality of a risen Christ, as Paul had on the road to Damascus, is something which still continues to happen to people, and is persuasive in a way. I mean, I would never have been persuaded by a sermon or by Christian doctrine, as if I was ever going to read it, even by the Narnia books. But that experience of an encounter with the reality of the resurrected Christ was life-changing, is life-changing, and I still continue to live in the kind of, not quite the afterburn of that, but the changed reality that you experience in that. And I think that's something you encounter in lots of religious traditions.
What do you think is going on, though, from your perspective, Derren, with Richard's encounter that he says he had? Because presumably you don't believe there was an encounter with a risen Christ, that presumably there's something psychological or something that can be reduced ultimately to...
I don't think it matters. I don't think that matters. I think it matters hugely. I don't think... I think what matters is that it happened. I think, various people might go, I think it was predominantly this experience or this or that, or it had its roots in this psychological thing or whatever. I don't think that's interesting. I think I think what's interesting is the richness and the truth, if you like, of something that makes us connect with that thing that is outside of ourselves. And I can't put a name on that or call it God. I don't think it is a thing. I think the trouble is finding the very words for it. But it's an experience, a sort of and I sort of turn it back in on itself. I think it's to do, for me, with a kind of how you live in a way that is coming to the edge of all the things you sort of comfortably accept. And I think that would also include a lot of religious teaching as well. Coming to the edge of those things, and in that kind of where yin meets yang kind of is where the sort of dialogue with yourself, and where the sort of individual meets the sort of the infinite is where meaning happens. I resist the idea of sort of giving it a name. I think it is a psychological experience, but I think it's the most important and valuable one that we have.
You sound fascinatingly, though, not very like an atheist at this point, because you're talking about something that is beyond yourself, that is, in a sense, the most important thing that there is. Well,
beyond myself, but also entirely myself and ultimately myself.
Because you're not sensing that with means beyond your cognition, are you, or your unconscious? It's not... I mean, I completely agree with you on that. My experience of the encounter with the resurrected Christ is like my experience with KFC. It's just something that's there. You know what I mean? And I perceive that with the senses that are made available in order to do that. But it's the richness of that experience and the power of it, I think.
Can I talk about death? Because
Please.
That is the place you end the book, talking about the fact that, across time, in a sense, death has always been, as it is put by St. Paul, the last enemy, and so on. And in a sense, the Christian story is obviously about God becoming incarnate and experiencing death, but overcoming death ultimately in the resurrection. Is that for you an important thing in terms of where we get our meaning? A lot of people would say that it's important to know that death is not the end, that somehow our life has a purpose that goes beyond our short span of years.
Yeah, I mean, lots of religions would argue the same thing, that this is not all there is, and there is something beyond our physical death. Christianity, of course, does it in a very particular way. And I think one of the reasons why it was so explosive for those who were witnesses to the events of Easter is because it was a total abject failure. That what happened was an absolute catastrophe. Everything went hideously wrong, and the person upon whom all they'd laid their expectation, however we understand that to be, ended up getting crucified and dying, and it was spectacularly game over, and everyone kind of scatters and runs off into the unknowability of history. And then all of a sudden a dead man is alive again. That's the kind of irreducible, I would say, fact at the heart of Christianity. Unlikely, but then of course it would be, wouldn't it? And I think in a post-Enlightenment world, when our sort of way in which we consider to be reliable authoritative evidence is about a method which deduces patterns and from that begins to make judgments about what's reliable, what happens. We're talking about a singularity. And if Christianity is right and that God did become human, well, he had to become a human in a place, in a time. So this unlikely, completely insignificant, dusty corner of the Roman Empire, it could have been everywhere, but it wasn't. It was there. And so the unlikelihood is absolutely built into that. So the fact that it is extremely unlikely, the fact that it does not accord with the kind of instruments that we'd bring to making judgments about the veracity of something now, is for me actually again part of its persuasiveness rather than its unpersuasiveness.
I mean, you obviously weren't persuaded.
Another thing that stands out here is how Richard Coles treats his experience of Jesus as proof of meaning. But personal experiences are not evidence of anything supernatural. People in every religion report powerful encounters with their gods. Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists all say the same thing. The human brain is very good at producing emotional and mystical experiences. Then he compares his encounter with Christ to eating KFC, like it is just something you experience and know is real. But that comparison kind of proves the point. Feeling something strongly does not make it true. People feel things all the time that turn out to be wrong. Meaning does not require a supernatural explanation. Humans build meaning through relationships, creativity, curiosity, and helping others. That comes from being human, not from believing a religious story.
When you looked into the resurrection, and I don't know whether in all honesty, what you've described, Richard, is in any sense, you're looking at the historical facts and making a deduction from it. I think obviously you've had an experience which you see in the light of that experience that people claimed back then as well. But for you, is the resurrection in that sense a sort of an important thing in which we find that meaning that allows us to hope, to have purpose, to have, I suppose, for many people who don't have any kind of opportunity as the three of us have to lead meaningful lives in a westernized country with all the opportunities that affords, the idea of a day of judgment and justice in a world to come is the only hope they may have of meaning eventually.
Well, I'll just say that it is for me. Lots of people seem to manage their lives, live their lives quite successfully and happily without having that, but it is for me in a way which is kind of unlike anything else, I think. And lots of people, I'm not alone, lots of people would share that experience. And one of the kind of odd things about that is when you kind of read people, come across people who've had that experience in either in different moments in history or in different places, there's often a sort of consonance about that that's kind of interesting, I think.
What do you make of people who do find their meaning in that particular way of seeing, and the resurrection in particular? I
sort of don't really consider it my business, but I suppose in as much as we're talking about it, I think it's I think all that sort of, I think the only thing that's any sort of value judgment anywhere in the mix is that there'd be a difference between sort of taking on board a religious belief because it's sort of comfortable, And as I've heard from friends of mine say, well, I don't have to think about that. There's kind of a nice, you don't have to think, you spend the rest of your life sweating and thinking over other things, and that is just nice and comfy, which of course is fine too. Again, none of my business if that is what someone wants to do. And a sort of religious belief in which a person can grow, again, spiritually in a wider sense of the word, and confront those, the edges and the doubts and the things that make us bigger and grow larger. There's Rilke has a poem about I can't remember the poem exactly, but he talks. No, it wasn't even a poem. No, it was in one of his letters. The idea of living in a large room or a small room. Some people live in a large room. Some people live in a small room. Some people just pace up and down by the window. So I sometimes think it's sort of me. I'm probably in that bit, but it's hard for me because I'm quite introverted and I'm a little bit shy, and I have to really summon up something to do things that I know will actually make life larger rather than just comfortable and smaller, and avoid stress, which is why I'm a good Stoic. Why that sits very comfortably with me. I think that's the thing that's important, and I think that's and if it's just the sort of a religious belief that's sort of one of comfort, which again is fine and none of my business, but then it's not much different from any number of other sort of comfortable things which ultimately don't really feed the soul, to use the word soul. And I think that's sort of the difference to me. I don't think it really matters too much where you find it. It's just the quality of it. Is it giving you a sort of energized connection to some sort of other? And I'm using words like that, which sounds like I'm talking about God. I'm talking about a purely psychological relationship with yourself and with the idea of the transcendent. I'm not. I know. I remember when I was a Christian, listening to atheists that remotely use that kind of language and going, oh well, he's obviously you can tell there's a God-shaped hole, and you can tell he believes in all that. I'm trying to articulate a kind of a psychological relationship to meaning.
But ultimately, if you find your meaning in a religious expression or in the resurrection, whatever it might be, that is great if it works for you at giving you that sense of meaning. But other people can find just the same meaning, in a sense, in the activities they pursue or the family life or whatever it might be that gives them that sense of comfort.
You sort of want to find the thing that's bigger than you, and and find the thing you love, and you throw yourself into that thing. That's sort of ultimately how we find meaning. And then from that, in terms of how it makes you grow, then I think it depends on your relationship with that.
I remember what's kind of different about Christianity for me is that it's not comforting or consoling.
Yes.
Can be, but actually much more than that is its challenge, I think. And it's what it returns to you is so not what you think you're going to get, I guess. This is something that happens in prayer an awful lot. I spent 2 years in a monastery kind of praying in a very organised sort of way. I'm fascinated by that. And what often struck me about that was the returns of it are just not what I thought they would be. And not in any, and I sometimes think people think that spirituality, again, gross generalisation, I don't mean you, by the way, think of it as a sort of accomplishment, things you master in order to achieve a kind of greater serenity or something like that. And I don't think that's what Christianity is at all, actually.
It should be uncomfortable, shouldn't it? All these things should be ultimately uncomfortable and challenging.
I remember once being in church on Good Friday, and there was a particularly gory crucifix standing on the altar, and a choir singing Allegri Miserere, heart-wrenching stuff about the absolute desolation of a God abandoned to death on a cross. And I remember at the end of it saying to my neighbour and saying, that was amazing, wasn't it? She said, yeah, it's very relaxing. And I thought, that's interesting, isn't it? What have we done as a church? I mean, I think another thing the Stoic virtues appeal to me very much is they do seem to give you a very good defence against lapsing into complacency about the awfulness of institutions. And the church is perhaps the most awful of institutions because the stakes are so high and it's been doing it for so long. I remember a bishop, I won't say which one, when I was particularly irked by something in the church, said, you must remember all institutions are demonic, which I think is probably true. And to cultivate a bit of Stoic detachment and a critical angle to that. I'm very interested in what you were saying also about aspects of the smoke and mirrors stuff. I spent a lot of time in Lincoln Cathedral, which, as you know, in the Middle Ages was a great place of pilgrimage, still is now. It's a spectacularly beautiful building. But I remember walking around it, and there's this thing called the pulpitum, which is this incredibly beautiful carved 14th century screen through which pilgrims would go on the way to the shrine of St. Hugh, kind of journey's end. And you go through it, and it's this wonderful evocation in stone, the absolute summit of the art of carving, of entering into a place of holiness and judgment. And then you look behind you, and it's just a blank wall. And it's so showbiz. It's so... And I'm very struck how religion, once it systematises and organises and seeks to mobilise people, begins to behave in that sort of way, because that's what institutions do. And in order to do, especially if your offer is supernatural, then it's good if you've got some smoke and mirrors to go with that.
Yeah, I ended up at a very happy clappy church in Croydon for a while, at the sort of peak of my some religious experience.
The sort of happiness in Croydon seems so
I
counterintuitive already. Sorry, Croydon.
Sorry, Croydon.
It's unfair. It has blossomed into non-entities and so on. And there was, I remember we were all told to stand up and talk in tongues, which obviously only a small percentage of the congregation would have been used to talking in tongues. So he said, just start making, and this is the pastor, just start making a noise and a sound. And if you think, oh, this is just silly, I'm just making a sound, that's the devil telling you that. And I sort of stood there, well, of course, this general babble's going on, thinking, well, it can't just be me that thinks this is just creating a sort of sensation. You know, has this all become reduced to a kind of a show, a sort of, a sort of an experience that may not even be that convincing for the individuals, but somehow when you put it all together, you sort of tell yourself the story that something amazing has happened. So yes, it's a bit of a shame, isn't it? A bit of a worldly thing that I don't know how you totally avoid that either, because you need to appeal to the emotions too, which religion's always been so good at.
Another thing that comes up in this discussion is the idea that meaning depends on the resurrection of Jesus. But when you actually look at the evidence, the resurrection is not something historians can verify. The New Testament accounts were written decades later, and even the stories themselves disagree about key details. Who went to the tomb, what they saw, and when it happened. More importantly, meaning does not require believing that someone came back from the dead. People find purpose in family, science, art, helping others, building communities. Those things exist in every culture, including places that were never Christian. Derren Brown makes an important point here. Meaning grows when people push themselves, face uncertainty, and search for something bigger than their own comfort. That process is psychological and human. So here is the question for you. Do humans actually need God to have meaning in life? Or can we create meaning ourselves through the way we live, the people we care about, and the things we build? Let me know what you think in the comments. I'm really curious to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more discussions like this.